My husband and his mistress thought I was just a trophy wife who was blind to their affair and clueless about business. They made a fatal mistake when they tried to seize the $200 million resort I had just inherited. They forgot that before I retreated to the kitchen, I was the architect who secretly built their entire empire in the shadows. Now, instead of signing over my legacy, I am about to bury them both. My name is Elena, and at 32 years old, I have perfected the art of being invisible. To the high society of New York, I am simply the decorative ornament on the arm of Derek, the visionary real estate developer reshaping the skyline. They see a woman who smiles on cue and hosts charity galas with practiced grace. They do not see the calluses on my fingers from sketching late into the night. They do not know that every award Derek places on our mantle belongs to me. For 5 years, I have been the ghost architect behind his genius, correcting his structural errors and refining his clumsy concepts into masterpieces, all while he basks in the applause I earned him. I told myself it was for love, for our partnership, but deep down, I knew I was just feeding a monster who had long since forgotten how to be a husband. Then there is Vanessa. She is his chief operating officer, a title that barely covers the extent of her involvement in his life. She is everything I am supposedly not: sharp, aggressive, and aggressively sexual in her power suits. When she comes to our penthouse for dinner, she looks at me with a specific brand of pity that feels more like a slap. It is the look one gives to a beloved but useless pet. She speaks over me, explaining simple business concepts as if I were a child, while Derek watches with an indulgent smirk, never once correcting her disrespect. They move in sync, sharing inside jokes and glances that act as a wall excluding me from my own marriage. The fragile ecosystem of our lie was shattered on a Tuesday morning when I received the call about Aunt Vivian. She was my mother's sister, an eccentric billionaire who lived in the mountains of Colorado, far away from the pretension of the East Coast. Her death was sudden, a heart attack while skiing, and it left a void I was not prepared to face. Derek, however, only saw an opportunity. He spent the days leading up to the will reading speculating about her portfolio, assuming that whatever she left would naturally fall under his experienced management to bolster his own failing ventures. The reading took place in a mahogany-paneled office in Manhattan. Derek sat forward in his chair, radiating confidence, while Vanessa sat just a little too close to him for a mere colleague. I sat quietly, grieving the one woman who had always told me I was destined for more than this. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, cleared his throat and began. Derek expected liquid assets, perhaps a few $1,000,000. Instead, Mr. Sterling dropped a bomb that sucked the air out of the room. I was the sole beneficiary, not Derek, not us as a couple, just me. And the inheritance was not a simple check. It was the Sapphire Peaks, the crown jewel of Aspen hospitality, a ski resort valued at $200 million. There was a catch, of course. Vivian knew me well. The will stipulated that I could not sell the property for 5 years. I had to own it. I had to keep it. The silence that followed was deafening. I saw the color drain from Vanessa's face, replaced instantly by a flash of raw, hungry calculation. Derek froze, his mouth slightly open. Then, like a switch had been flipped, the mask slid back into place. The cold indifference they had shown me all morning evaporated. Derek grabbed my hand, squeezing it painfully tight, beaming with a terrifyingly fake enthusiasm. Vanessa leaned in, cooing about how wonderful this was for the family, her eyes darting between us like a predator assessing a wounded deer. The ride home in the limousine was suffocating. The partition was up, enclosing us in a private chamber of manipulation. Derek wasted no time. He did not ask how I felt about losing my aunt or inheriting a legacy. He started chipping away at my confidence. He told me, with a voice dripping with faux concern, that the Sapphire Peaks was a beast of a business, far too complex for someone with my delicate constitution. He reminded me of how overwhelmed I get with just planning a dinner party, A blatant lie, considering I project managed his last 3 skyscrapers from the shadows. He sighed, acting as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He said he wanted to protect me from the stress. He proposed a solution, presenting it as a gift. He suggested that as soon as we got home, I should sign a power of attorney. He and Vanessa would take on the heavy lifting, managing the resort through his company to spare me the headache. They would handle the finances, the operations, and the decisions, allowing me to enjoy the profits without the burden. He looked at me with those blue eyes that used to make my heart flutter, expecting me to nod and obey as I always had. But for the first time, I looked back and saw not a protector, but a thief standing at the gates of my future. The sudden warmth in Derek's demeanor was more alarming than his usual coldness ever was. It felt performed, a desperate script being acted out by a man who was sweating under his collar. That night, after he fell into a Scotch-induced sleep, I slipped out of bed and crept into his home office. I needed to understand the urgency behind his request for power of attorney. I had not touched the family accounts in years, trusting him to manage the empire I helped design, but I knew his passwords. He was arrogant, and arrogant men rarely change their credentials. What I found on the screen made my breath hitch in my throat. The ledger was a sea of red. Derek was not just having a bad quarter, he was drowning. He had leveraged our liquid assets into high-risk cryptocurrency schemes that had collapsed completely. He was millions of dollars in debt, and there were transfers that looked dangerously close to embezzlement from his investors. He did not just want the resort, he needed it. Without a massive infusion of cash to cover his tracks, he was looking at federal prison time. I heard the click of the front door downstairs. Vanessa. She had a key, of course. I turned off the monitor and hid in the shadows of the hallway as Derek woke up and went down to meet her. Their voices floated up the stairs, not in whispers, but in the confident tones of people who believe they are untouchable. I heard Vanessa laugh, a sharp, cruel sound. She asked him if the stupid cash cow had signed the papers yet. My stomach turned. I was the cash cow. Derek replied that he was working on it, that he just needed to massage my ego a little more. They began discussing a loophole in the trust law that would allow them to liquidate the Sapphire Peaks immediately, bypassing the 5-year restriction by declaring the property distressed. They were planning to strip my legacy for parts to save their own skins. I retreated to the guest bedroom, my heart pounding against my ribs. But my detective work was not done. I remembered an old iPad Derek had discarded in a drawer when he upgraded last month. I plugged it in. It was still logged into his iCloud. As the messages synced, the full picture of my humiliation downloaded before my eyes. It was not just a financial betrayal. The thread with Vanessa went back 3 years. Explicit photos, mocking texts about my cooking, my clothes, and my naivety. They had a joint account in the Caymans where they were funneling money for a future together. Then I saw the text that froze my blood. It was from yesterday. Vanessa had suggested that if I refused to sign, they should push the narrative that grief had made me unstable. Derek had replied that he already had a doctor on payroll willing to testify that I needed institutionalized care. They were not just going to steal my money, they were prepared to lock me away in a mental ward to do it. A normal woman might have screamed. She might have marched downstairs and thrown the iPad at their heads. But I was an architect. I knew that if you attack a structure without finding the weak point, you only hurt yourself. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced my face into a mask of calm. I would play the part of the oblivious, trusting wife a little longer. I needed time. The next morning, while Derek was in the shower, I used a burner phone to call Mr. Sterling. I told him everything. The old lawyer did not sound surprised. He told me that Aunt Vivian had suspected Derek was a fraud for a long time, which was exactly why she had tied up the inheritance. Then he lowered his voice and told me that Vivian had left something for me. She called it an insurance policy. It was locked inside the wall safe in the master suite of the resort in Aspen. He said it was the weapon I would need to cut the head off the snake. When I walked into the kitchen, Derek and Vanessa were drinking coffee, looking like a power couple. I poured myself a cup and smiled, making sure my hand trembled just slightly to look weak. I told them that I was overwhelmed by the paperwork, but I felt I could not sign away Aunt Vivian's legacy without seeing it one last time. I told them I wanted to go to Aspen for a few days just to walk the halls and say goodbye. The panic in Derek's eyes was instant. He exchanged a frantic look with Vanessa. He could not risk me going there alone and talking to the staff or finding out the truth about the property's value. He immediately insisted that I should not travel alone in my fragile state. He said they would clear their schedules and fly me there on the private jet. They thought they were chaperoning a victim to the slaughter, but they were actually walking right into the trap I was setting. The flight to Aspen was a masterclass in condescension, enclosed in the leather-clad cabin of the private jet. Derek and Vanessa spent 4 hours speaking a language they assumed I could not understand. They threw around acronyms like EBITDA and cap rates, discussing yield management strategies while glancing at me with patronizing smiles. They were trying to bury me under an avalanche of jargon, reinforcing the narrative that the Sapphire Peaks was a complex beast that would chew me up and spit me out. I sipped my sparkling water and nodded vacantly, while internally I was dissecting their strategy. They were desperate to make me feel small, which only confirmed how big a threat I actually was. When the resort finally came into view, rising against the snow-capped mountains like a modern fortress of timber and glass, my breath caught. It was magnificent. But as the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the architect in me took over. While Derek and Vanessa cooed over the aesthetics, I saw the rot. I noticed the slight discoloration on the cedar siding that indicated delayed weatherproofing. I saw the perimeter lighting blazing at 2 in the afternoon, a hemorrhaging of utility costs that screamed of operational negligence. This was not a well-oiled machine. It was a leaking ship. We were ushered immediately into the executive boardroom, a glass-walled aquarium overlooking the slopes. The management team was waiting. They were a collection of men in expensive suits who smelled of cologne and arrogance. They fawned over Derek, shaking his hand with vigorous enthusiasm, treating him as the returning conqueror. To them, I was merely the widow, the grieving accessory to the real power. The general manager barely made eye contact with me before turning his attention back to my husband. Vanessa wasted no time asserting her dominance. She took the seat at the head of the table, the spot that should have been mine, and opened the meeting with the authority of an owner. She directed the conversation, cutting off subordinates and dismissing concerns with a wave of her manicured hand. She treated me like a silent intern, occasionally explaining simple terms in a loud, slow voice as if I were hard of hearing. I sat in the corner, clutching a notepad, making myself look as harmless as possible. But as the chief financial officer, a sweaty man named Henderson, who was clearly one of Derek's cronies, flashed spreadsheets on the screen, I began to write. I did not write down their talking points. I wrote down the lies. The maintenance budget was inflated by 300%. The vendor contracts were vague and overpriced. It was a masterclass in creative accounting, designed to siphon money out of the resort and into pockets where it did not belong. The meeting was interrupted by a frantic knock on the door. The facilities manager burst in, looking pale. The heating system in the VIP wing had failed. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and their most high-profile guests were threatening to check out. Vanessa immediately seized the moment to play the hero. She declared that we needed to call in an emergency contractor she knew, a firm that charged triple the market rate for expedited service. She claimed it would cost $50,000, but it was necessary to save the resort's reputation. Derek nodded gravely, agreeing that we had no choice. That was when I stood up. The room went silent as I walked over to the wall where the master blueprints were framed for decoration. I asked the facilities manager to hand me his radio. Vanessa tried to stop me, saying I should let the professionals handle it, but I ignored her. I placed a finger on the schematic, a drawing I knew by heart because I had spent nights redrawing it for Aunt Vivian when the original architect failed to account for thermal expansion. I told the manager to radio his team in the mechanical room. I instructed them to bypass the main boiler interface and manually reset the secondary pressure valve located behind the maintenance panel on the third sub-level. I explained that the system was designed with a failsafe that often tripped during sudden pressure drops, locking the valve to prevent an explosion. It was not broken, it was just locked. 5 minutes later, the radio crackled to life. The heat was back on. The cost was $0. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The engineers looked at me with open-mouthed shock. The general manager looked confused. But Derek, he looked like he had seen a ghost. He was sweating, his eyes darting between me and the blueprints. He realized in that moment that the wife he thought was an idiot knew more about this building than his entire team combined. I walked back to the table, but I did not sit in the corner. I stood at the head, right next to where Vanessa was sitting. I told them that I had changed my mind about leaving. I announced that I would be staying at the Sapphire Peaks indefinitely to conduct a full audit of the operations. I turned to the general manager and requested that the office next to the boardroom be cleared for my personal use immediately. Derek tried to stammer a protest, but the look I gave him froze the words in his throat. His plan for a quick takeover had just crashed into a wall of reinforced concrete. The atmosphere at the Sapphire Peaks shifted overnight from open hostility to a terrifying, suffocating concern. Derek and Vanessa realized they could not beat me on technical grounds, so they decided to destroy my credibility instead. It started with whispers in the break room and sympathetic glances from the reception staff. I heard rumors floating through the corridors that I was suffering from a severe breakdown following Aunt Vivian's death, that I was paranoid, delusional, and unfit to make decisions. They were painting a portrait of a madwoman, and they were using my own exhaustion as the paint. My exhaustion, however, was not natural. I began to notice a pattern. Every afternoon, Vanessa would bring me a cup of herbal tea, her voice dripping with faux sweetness as she insisted I needed to hydrate. Within 20 minutes of drinking it, a heavy fog would descend over my brain. My limbs felt like lead, and my thoughts swam in a thick, viscous haze. During budget meetings, I would slur my words or lose my train of thought entirely. I saw the board members exchanging worried looks, reinforcing the narrative Derek was spinning. Vanessa would smile tightly, apologize for my condition, and take over the presentation, looking every inch the capable leader while I struggled to keep my eyes open. The sabotage went beyond the chemical. Documents I had meticulously prepared would vanish from my desk, only to reappear later with crucial pages missing or figures altered. Appointments were deleted from my digital calendar, causing me to miss meetings with key investors. When I confronted them, Derek would look at me with sad, puppy dog eyes and suggest that perhaps I was forgetting things, that the stress was causing memory gaps. It was gaslighting in its purest, most brutal form, but they underestimated my survival instinct. On the 4th day, instead of drinking the tea, I poured it into a sterile sample jar I had hidden in my purse. I overnighted it to an independent toxicology lab in Denver under a false name. While I waited for the results, I went hunting for the weapon Mr. Sterling had promised. Late one night, while Derek and Vanessa were out celebrating their perceived victory, I opened the wall safe in the master suite using the combination Aunt Vivian had left in her letter. Inside was not money or jewelry, but a thick black binder. As I leafed through the pages, I realized the magnitude of the corruption. It was a detailed log of every bribe, every kickback, and every falsified invoice the previous management team had processed. More importantly, it showed a direct financial link to a shell company owned by Derek. He had been bleeding this resort dry long before I inherited it. I knew I could not fight this war alone, so I turned to the people Derek and Vanessa treated like furniture. I went to the kitchens, the laundry rooms, and the maintenance sheds. I spoke to the maids who had been yelled at by Vanessa for minor infractions, and the waiters whose tips Derek had pocketed. I did not offer them bribes. I offered them dignity and a promise of justice. I built a network of eyes and ears within the resort walls. The payoff was immediate. A terrified housekeeper knocked on my office door one evening, clutching a small digital voice recorder. She had found it under the sofa in the penthouse suite where Derek and Vanessa were staying. She had turned it on by accident while cleaning. I played the file, my blood turning to ice. It was a recording of an argument from 2 nights ago. Vanessa was screaming that I was becoming a problem that would not go away. Derek's voice, cold and detached, replied that if I did not sign the papers soon, they would have to make me disappear permanently. It was a death threat. 2 days later, Derek announced he was throwing a lavish gala to introduce the new management team to the press and local elite. He did not ask me. He simply informed me that it was happening. It was clearly a coronation ceremony for Vanessa, designed to publicly cement her role as the face of the Sapphire Peaks while shunting me into the shadows. I looked at the invitation on his desk, then up at his smug face. I decided it was time to spring the trap. I feigned a dizzy spell, clutching the edge of the table for effect. I told him that perhaps he was right, that I was too unwell to handle the pressure. I told him I would stay in my room during the gala and let him and Vanessa handle everything. The relief that washed over his face was pathetic. He thought he had finally broken me. He had no idea that I was simply clearing the stage for his execution. The toxicology report arrived in my encrypted email inbox at 3 a.m. The results were printed in stark black and white, confirming what my gut had already screamed at me. My blood contained high concentrations of powerful, unprescribed sedatives. They were not just trying to make me feel crazy, they were chemically lobotomizing me. The realization turned my fear into a cold, hard diamond of rage. I realized I was living with potential murderers. The next day, while Derek and Vanessa were out touring the slopes, I installed micro cameras inside the smoke detectors of my bedroom and office. The installation was simple, a trick I learned from supervising smart home integrations in high-security penthouses. That evening, I watched the live feed on my phone. I saw Vanessa slip into my room, looking over her shoulder like a common thief. She opened my bottle of daily vitamins, dumped them into her purse, and replaced them with identical-looking pills from a prescription bottle she had pulled from her pocket. It was a violation so intimate and so calculated that I physically shook with anger. I had the footage. I had the proof. But I needed more than just proof of assault. I needed to dismantle their financial escape route. Under the cover of darkness, while the rest of the resort slept, I snuck Mr. Sterling and a team of 3 forensic auditors into the service entrance. They had flown in from New York on a private charter to avoid detection. We turned the conference room into a war room. For 6 hours, we dissected the resort's recent activity. What we found was staggering. In just the first week of their unauthorized management, Derek had funneled $5 million out of the resort's operating accounts. He had set up a shell company called Peak Maintenance Solutions and signed a phantom contract for emergency renovations that were never scheduled to happen. He was looting the treasury before I could even take the reins. While the auditors worked the numbers, I worked the people. I knew that a general is nothing without an army, so I went to the trenches. I met with the executive chef in the walk-in freezer and the head of housekeeping in the linen closet. I listened to their grievances about unpaid overtime and Vanessa's verbal abuse. I looked them in the eye and promised them a 20% raise and full benefits packages the moment I took full control. I showed them that I was not the aloof widow in the ivory tower, but a worker who respected their labor. I secured their silence and their loyalty. The tension reached a breaking point 2 days later in the main lobby. Vanessa, drunk on her stolen power, decided to fire Mr. Henderson, a concierge who had served the resort for 20 years. Her reasoning was that he looked too old and ruined the youthful vibe she wanted to cultivate. The staff watched in horrified silence as she berated him in front of guests. I stepped out of the shadows. My voice did not tremble. I walked straight up to Vanessa and told her to stop. I turned to Mr. Henderson and told him to return to his post, assuring him that his job was secure. When Vanessa tried to screech about her authority, I cut her off with a gaze so withering she actually took a step back. I told her loudly, so every bellhop and receptionist could hear, that she was a guest here, and guests do not fire staff. The humiliation was too much for them. Minutes later, Derek dragged me into the private study, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. His mask of the concerned husband was gone, replaced by the snarling face of a cornered animal. He threw a manila envelope onto the desk. Photographs spilled out. They showed me in compromising positions with a local ski instructor I had never met. They were deepfakes, digitally manipulated images designed to destroy my reputation. He leaned in close, his breath hot and smelling of stale whiskey. He hissed that if I did not sign the transfer papers by tomorrow, he would leak these photos to every tabloid in America. He said he would paint me as a slut who dishonored her aunt's memory while her husband tried to save the family business. I looked at the photos, then at the man I had shared a bed with for 5 years. I felt the last tether of emotional attachment snap. There was no sadness left, no lingering hope for redemption. He was not my husband anymore. He was a cancer that needed to be cut out. I looked him in the eye and said nothing, letting him believe his threat had worked. But as I walked out of that room, I made a decision. I was done playing defense. I was done gathering shields. It was time to pick up a sword. The next morning, Derek and Vanessa made their move to sell off a massive parcel of pristine forest land attached to the resort. This was strictly forbidden by Aunt Vivian's will, which mandated conservation, but they had found a shady developer willing to overlook the legalities for a steep discount. They called a meeting in the Grand Salon to close the deal, confident that I was cowed into submission. I watched from the doorway as Vanessa stood before the projection screen. She was presenting a concept for luxury condos to replace the ancient pines. My stomach churned as I recognized the renderings. They were my old designs, sketches I had made years ago for an eco-friendly retreat, now twisted and repurposed to sell a concrete monstrosity. She had erased my signature block and was claiming the vision as her own, charming the investor with borrowed brilliance. I adjusted my blazer and pushed open the double doors. I did not walk in like a grieving widow. I walked in like the CEO I was born to be. Vanessa faltered mid-sentence as I approached the head of the table. Without asking for permission, I cut the power to her projector. I turned to the investor, a serious man named Mr. Blackwood, and apologized for the interruption. I told him that the presentation he was seeing was unauthorized and plagiarized. I pulled my own tablet from my bag and connected it to the screen. I did not just show pictures, I showed a future. I presented a plan for high-end, sustainable glamping pods that would preserve the forest while generating triple the revenue of condos over 10 years. When Vanessa tried to interrupt, claiming my numbers were fantasy, I pivoted to the technicals. I asked her to explain the load-bearing capacity of the cantilevered decks in her design. I asked her about the R value of the glass she proposed. She stammered, her face flushing red, unable to answer basic questions about the drawings she claimed to have created. I answered them for her, citing the specific engineering codes and thermal dynamics involved. Mr. Blackwood looked from Vanessa's flustered face to my calm, authoritative demeanor. He closed his portfolio. He told Derek that he did not do business with frauds. He stood up, shook my hand, and walked out, taking with him the millions of dollars in illicit down payments Derek was counting on. The silence in the room after the door clicked shut was explosive. Derek lunged across the table, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. His eyes were wild. He snarled that I had just cost him everything. He gave me an ultimatum, his voice trembling with rage. I had until tomorrow night to sign the transfer papers. If I refused, he would release the deepfake sex tape to every news outlet in the country. He promised to ruin me so thoroughly that I would not be able to show my face in public again. Vanessa laughed, a shrill, ugly sound. She mocked me, saying I was all alone. She taunted me, saying I had no family, no friends, and no allies in this town. She called me an ant trying to fight a boot. I pulled my arm free from Derek's grip and smoothed my sleeve. I looked them both in the eye, feeling a strange, cold clarity. I told them that they were wrong. I told them I had the only two things that mattered: the truth and the deed to the property. I left them standing in the wreckage of their failed deal and went straight to my office. I did not go to sleep. Instead, I compiled the forensic audit report, the recordings of their threats, the evidence of the shell companies, and the logs of the stolen designs. I attached everything to a secure email addressed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I hit send, but I added a note requesting a 24-hour hold on the arrest warrants. I did not just want them caught. I wanted them destroyed publicly, at the very moment they thought they had won. The 50th anniversary gala of the Sapphire Peaks was designed to be the social event of the season, a glittering display of wealth and power that would cement Derek's status as the king of Aspen. But as I looked at the schedule, I saw it for what it really was. It was a public execution. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. I was to be paraded in front of the cameras, looking frail and confused, where I would tearfully announce my early retirement due to severe mental health struggles. To ensure the narrative stuck, they had even invited Dr. Thorne, a psychiatrist with a suspended license and a heavy gambling debt, who was currently sipping champagne in the lobby, ready to offer his professional opinion to any reporter who asked. I stood in my dressing room, staring at my reflection. For years, Derek had chosen my wardrobe, favoring muted pastels and modest cuts that made me fade into the background. Tonight, I had made my own choice. Hanging on the door was a gown of deep, blood-red silk. It was structured, sharp, and unapologetic. It was not a dress for a wife. It was armor for a warrior. Before I could put it on, the door swung open without a knock. Vanessa breezed in, holding a large glass of red wine. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on the garment bag I had left unzipped on the sofa, revealing a soft cream-colored dress I had laid out as a decoy. With a theatrical stumble, she lurched forward, splashing the dark liquid all over the pale fabric. She brought a hand to her mouth in mock horror, though her eyes were dancing with malice. She told me she was so clumsy and that it was a shame I would have to wear something old and frumpy now, something that would make me look even more pathetic on stage. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply watched her gloat. When she finally left to take her place in the wings, I walked to the locked closet and pulled out the real dress. The red silk fit me like a second skin. I applied my lipstick, a shade as dark as the wine she had spilled, and stepped out of the room. I met Mr. Sterling in the service corridor, away from prying eyes. Behind him stood 4 men who looked like they were carved from granite. This was my new security detail, a private team I had hired using funds from my personal savings. They replaced Derek's hired thugs an hour ago, a change I had not yet announced. Mr. Sterling nodded to me, his face grim but determined. He handed me a small earpiece, which I tucked into my hair. We were ready. I made my way toward the ballroom, the sound of the orchestra growing louder with every step. Just before I reached the backstage entrance, a hand shot out and grabbed my upper arm. It was Derek. He pulled me into a shadowy alcove, his grip bruising my skin. He leaned in close, his face a mask of desperate aggression. He whispered that this was the end of the line. He reminded me of the deepfake photos, telling me that if I deviated from the script by even one word, he would upload them before I left the stage. He told me to smile, look crazy, and hand over the kingdom. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then up into his eyes. I did not tremble. I did not beg. I leaned forward until my lips were inches from his ear. I told him that he should be less worried about me and more worried about his own seat. I pulled my arm free and walked away, leaving him staring after me in confusion. I stepped into the wings of the stage. The lights were blindingly bright. Beyond them, hundreds of guests waited in the darkness. To my left, Vanessa and Derek stood together, adjusting their microphones, their faces set in expressions of victorious anticipation. They thought they were about to bury me. They did not know I had brought a shovel for them. Derek took the stage first, bathing in the spotlight he believed was his birthright. He adjusted the microphone with a practiced solemnity, his voice dropping an octave to convey deep, performative concern. He spoke of the immense pressure of legacy and how, tragically, the burden of managing such a vast empire had proven too heavy for his beloved wife. He wove a narrative of a fragile woman cracking under strain, pausing at the right moments to let the sympathy of the audience marinate. The room was silent, hanging on his every word, completely bought into the tragedy he was selling. Vanessa stood a step behind him, nodding gravely, playing the role of the supportive family friend to perfection. When Derek beckoned for me to join them, framing it as a final farewell to my public life before I sought treatment, Vanessa stepped forward to offer her arm. She acted as if I were an invalid who could barely walk without assistance, her touch lingering with a faux tenderness that made my skin crawl. I ignored her outstretched hand and walked to the podium with a steady, rhythmic click of my heels that echoed through the sound system. I took the microphone, feeling the cold metal against my palm. Derek handed me a folded piece of paper, the resignation speech he had written for me, which included a humiliating admission of incompetence and mental instability. I placed it unopened on the lectern and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. The room was filled with the elite of Aspen, journalists, and key stakeholders. I did not speak of exhaustion or mental collapse. Instead, I began to speak of history. I spoke of Aunt Vivian's vision, of the blood and sweat built into the foundation of the Sapphire Peaks, and the integrity required to maintain it. As Derek started to frown, realizing I was deviating from the script, I looked up at the control booth. My new head technician, a man Derek had ignored for years, caught my eye. I gave a barely perceptible nod. Suddenly, the slide reading Elena's farewell vanished from the massive LED screen behind us. In its place, a high-definition video feed flickered to life. The audio boomed through the auditorium speakers, crisp and undeniable. The crowd gasped as they saw the interior of my private office projected 40 feet high. They watched Vanessa sneak in, her face twisted in a sneer, and swap my vitamins for sedatives. The clarity was devastating. Every label on the bottle was legible. Then the scene cut to the bedroom, capturing Derek laughing as he told his mistress that he had built his entire career on my discarded sketches, calling me a useful idiot who would never figure out he was stealing from me. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the ballroom. Phones that had been lowered were suddenly raised high, hundreds of lenses live-streaming the destruction of a reputation in real time. Beside me, I heard a choked sound. I turned to see the color drain from Derek's face until he looked like a wax figure. Vanessa stood with her mouth agape, her hand trembling so violently she dropped her wine glass, the shatter lost in the growing murmur of the crowd. I did not stop there. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the video was replaced by a series of complex spreadsheets. It was a forensic accounting of the last week, highlighting the $5 million Derek had siphoned into shell companies to cover his gambling debts. I spoke clearly, my voice ringing out over the chaos. I detailed every dollar stolen, every lie told. I pointed a finger directly at Vanessa, stripping away her title of Chief Operating Officer and revealing her as the architect of my misery. A woman who abused staff and destroyed a marriage for profit. The shock on Derek's face morphed into a primal, animalistic rage. He realized there was no talking his way out of this. The deepfakes he threatened me with were useless now. No one would believe a known thief and poisoner. With a roar of fury, he lunged at me, his hands reaching for the microphone, or perhaps my throat, desperate to silence the truth. But he never reached me. My security team materialized from the shadows of the stage wings. 2 burly guards intercepted him mid-stride, tackling him to the floor with a bone-jarring thud right in front of the rolling cameras. The flashbulbs erupted like lightning, capturing the King of Aspen pinned to the ground like a common criminal. The chaos that erupted in the ballroom was not the disorganized panic of a tragedy, but the precise, surgical strike of justice. The doors at the back of the hall burst open, admitting a dozen officers from the Aspen Police Department and agents from the FBI whom I had alerted days prior. They moved through the crowd with efficiency, converging on the stage where my security team still held Derek against the floor. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest music I had ever heard. An officer read Derek his rights, his voice booming over the stunned silence, listing charges of embezzlement, extortion, and wire fraud. Vanessa, realizing that her proximity to Derek was now a liability rather than an asset, attempted to flee. She kicked off her heels and tried to blend into the throng of confused guests moving toward the exits. She thought she could slip out through the kitchen service doors, but she had forgotten who she was dealing with. The staff she had tormented for days, the waiters she had yelled at, and the busboys she had ignored formed a human wall in front of the exit. Mr. Henderson, the concierge she had fired, stood at the center with his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. She was trapped like a rat in a cage until an officer grabbed her wrists and marched her out in front of the cameras. I stood alone at the podium, smoothing the skirt of my red dress. I waited for the commotion to settle slightly before leaning into the microphone one last time. I told the press and the trembling board members that from this day forward, the Sapphire Peaks would be managed by its rightful owner. I looked directly into the lens of the nearest news camera and declared that I was officially filing for divorce from the con artist currently being shoved into a squad car. The market reaction was swift and brutal. Before the police cruisers had even left the driveway, phones lit up across the room. Investors were frantically calling their brokers to dump stock in Derek's private development firm. His partners issued statements distancing themselves from him within the hour. The empire he had built on my talent and his lies collapsed into dust before the sun even rose. I learned later from the detectives that the loyalty between my husband and his mistress dissolved the moment they were placed in separate holding cells. It was a race to see who could betray the other first. Derek screamed that Vanessa was the mastermind, claiming she had manipulated him into cutting corners. Vanessa, terrified of a long prison sentence, sang like a canary. She detailed every illegal transaction, every bribe, and every falsified ledger, hoping to trade her testimony for a plea deal. However, their situation became infinitely worse when my lawyer handed the district attorney the toxicology report and the footage of Vanessa tampering with my drink. The charges were no longer limited to financial crimes. The evidence of the sedatives upgraded their indictments to conspiracy to commit bodily harm and attempted murder. The judge set their bail at an amount so astronomical that neither of them could pay it, ensuring they would rot in jail while awaiting trial. Mr. Sterling filed the divorce papers the very next morning. We cited the criminal charges and the adultery, which triggered the morality clause in our prenuptial agreement. Derek would leave the marriage with absolutely nothing. He had violated the contract in the most public way possible, meaning he had no claim to my inheritance, my earnings, or even the apartment we had shared. I did not spare Vanessa either. I filed a civil lawsuit against her for defamation, emotional distress, and invasion of privacy. I went after her assets with ruthless precision, freezing her bank accounts and placing liens on her property. I wanted to ensure that when she eventually finished her prison sentence, she would step out into the world with $0 to her name. The media narrative flipped overnight. The tabloids that Derek had hoped would paint me as a crazy woman instead hailed me as the Iron Widow of Aspen. Architectural magazines began running retrospectives on Derek's past projects, finally correcting the record and crediting me as the true designer behind the award-winning skyscrapers. My name was etched onto the blueprints where it had always belonged. And for the first time in my life, the world saw me not as a wife, but as the architect of my own destiny. 3 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings that moved with surprising speed. The evidence I had provided was so comprehensive, so damning, that the trial was less of a battle and more of a formality. The jury did not need days to deliberate. They needed hours. Derek was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Vanessa received 8 years for her role in the scheme and the assault charges. The gavel came down, and just like that, the monsters under my bed were locked away in concrete cages. Before I left New York for good, I went to see Derek one last time. I needed to see him without the expensive suits, without the power, and without the arrogance. He sat behind the glass partition in a drab gray jumpsuit, looking 20 years older than he had at the gala. The moment he saw me, he broke down. He pressed his hands against the glass, weeping, begging for forgiveness. He promised he could change, that he still loved me, that we could start over when he got out. It was pathetic. I did not say a word. I simply slid the divorce papers, already signed, through the slot. On top of the papers, I placed my wedding ring. It was a diamond, yes, but in that moment, it looked like cheap glass to me. I stood up, turned my back on his pleading cries, and walked out into the sunlight. I sold the penthouse in Manhattan the following week. I did not want the memories, the furniture, or the stale air of a life lived in the shadows. I packed only my clothes and my sketchbooks and moved permanently to Aspen. The transition was seamless. Under my direct leadership, the Sapphire Peaks did not just survive, it thrived. We posted record profits in the first quarter. The staff, now paid fairly and treated with dignity, worked with a passion that money cannot buy. The resort became the premier destination in the country, not because of marketing tricks, but because it had a soul again. To honor the woman who made this possible, I established the Vivian Foundation. It is a scholarship fund dedicated to young female architects who are struggling to break into a male-dominated industry. I wanted to ensure that no other talented woman would ever have to hide her genius behind a man just to get a building built. It was the legacy Aunt Vivian deserved. Life in the mountains brought other surprises too. Last week, I ran into an old colleague from my firm in New York, a man who had been the only one to ever compliment my drafts instead of Derek's presentations. He had come to Aspen to consult on a new wing I was designing. We grabbed coffee, and for the first time in years, I sat across from a man who looked at me with genuine respect, interested in my mind rather than what I could do for his career. It is early days, and I am in no rush, but it is nice to know that kindness exists. On the afternoon the divorce was finalized, I took the ski lift to the highest peak of the mountain. The air was thin and biting cold, filling my lungs with a sharpness that made me feel alive. I looked down at the valley below, at the sprawling beauty of my resort glowing in the twilight. I was no longer the ghost architect. I was no longer the silent wife. I was Elena, the owner, the builder, the survivor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old cell phone, the one that held the history of Derek's gaslighting and the threatening messages. I did not need it anymore. I did not need the proof of my trauma to validate my strength. With a swing of my arm, I threw the device out over the edge. I watched it tumble down into the vast white abyss until it disappeared completely. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my cheeks, and I smiled. It was not the polite smile of a trophy wife. It was the fierce, satisfied smile of a woman who had lost everything and won back the only thing that mattered, herself. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Derek and Vanessa's punishment. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.